"If you can play the piano, I'll marry you," mocked the Dragon Empress, and the dish cleaner played it. David Reed scrubbed the same plate for the third time, his mind wandering as soap suds dripped from his worn hands. The kitchen staff of the Imperial Palace moved around him like a well-oiled machine, preparing the evening feast for creatures that could incinerate him with a single breath. 5 years he had been here on Dracoris Prime, washing dishes and cleaning pots, invisible to everyone who mattered. The dragons barely noticed humans existed. To them, David and his kind were just another species of servant, slightly more useful than the cleaning robots but far less interesting than the exotic pets some nobles kept. He had watched hundreds of his fellow humans shuffle through these corridors over the years, heads down, voices quiet, trying not to draw attention to themselves. In the distance, through the kitchen's reinforced windows, David could see the crystal spires of the capital city stretching toward the purple sky. Each tower was a work of art that would have taken human architects centuries to design. Yet the dragons had grown them overnight using their natural ability to manipulate matter at the molecular level. Everything about this world reminded him that humans were the newcomers here, the weak ones, the species that had barely figured out how to travel between stars while others had been building galactic empires for thousands of years. His left hand cramped as he gripped the plate tighter. The old injury still bothered him, especially when the weather changed or when he worked too long without rest. Dr. Mills back on Earth had told him the nerve damage was permanent, that he would never play professionally again. That had been 7 years ago, but the memory still cut deep every time his fingers refused to move the way they once had. A crash echoed through the kitchen as one of the newer human workers dropped a tray of crystal glasses. The sound made everyone freeze. Master Chef Gorth, a massive dragon whose scales shifted from green to angry red when displeased, turned his enormous head toward the source of the noise. His golden eyes blazed with irritation. "Clumsy mammals," Gorth rumbled, his voice like distant thunder. "Perhaps I should request mechanical units instead. At least they do not break my finest servingware." David watched the young human worker, probably no more than 20, scramble to clean up the shards while tears streamed down his face. The boy's hands shook so badly he cut himself on the broken crystal, adding drops of red blood to the mess on the floor. None of the dragon staff moved to help. To them, this was simply the natural order of things. "I will handle this, Master Chef," David said quietly, setting down his plate and moving toward the accident. He knelt beside the crying worker and began carefully picking up the larger pieces while the boy held his bleeding palm. "What is your name?" David asked in a low voice that only the human could hear. "Peter," the boy whispered back. "Peter Walsh. I just arrived last week from the colony on New Dublin. First rule here, Peter, never let them see you cry. Dragons respect strength even if they do not respect us." David helped the boy to his feet and handed him a clean towel for his cut hand. "Go to the medical station and get that bandaged. I will finish cleaning this up." As Peter hurried away, David continued collecting the broken pieces, his movements careful and methodical. He had learned long ago that surviving in the Dragon Empire meant being useful without being noticed, competent without being threatening. Humans who drew too much attention either way tended to disappear from their positions quickly. The evening rush began an hour later, and David lost himself in the familiar rhythm of washing, rinsing, and stacking. The work was mindless enough that his thoughts could wander, and they always wandered to the same place. In the abandoned sections of the palace where old Earth artifacts collected dust in forgotten storage rooms, he had found something that made his exile bearable. The piano had probably been brought here decades ago by some human diplomat trying to impress the Dragon Court with examples of Earth culture. Like most human creations, it had been dismissed as primitive and stored away to be forgotten. But David had spent the last 3 years slowly teaching himself to play it again, working around his damaged hand, finding new ways to create the music that had once been his entire world. Tonight, after the kitchen closed and the palace settled into its nighttime quiet, he would make his way through the service corridors to that dusty room. He would sit at the old piano and let his fingers remember what they had lost, even if they could never quite recapture it. The music was different now, marked by the limitations of his injury, but somehow that made it more honest, more real. Master Chef Gorth dismissed the kitchen staff just after midnight. David waited until the corridors were empty, before making his careful way through the maze of service passages that honeycombed the ancient palace. The dragons had built this place to last forever, but they had also built it large enough that entire sections could be abandoned without anyone noticing. The room where he practiced had once been a small concert hall, back when the palace occasionally hosted diplomatic functions that included humans. Now it was just another forgotten space filled with dust and memories, but the piano was still there, still functional despite years of neglect. David sat at the familiar bench and let his hands settle on the keys. The first few notes were always the hardest, when his left hand remembered what it used to be able to do and protested at what it could do now. But gradually, as he worked through his exercises, the old magic began to return. He played Bach tonight, as he often did. The mathematical precision of the compositions appealed to something deep in his engineer's mind, while their emotional complexity spoke to the musician's heart he had thought was dead. His left hand struggled with some of the more complex passages, but he had learned to adapt, to find new fingerings that worked around his limitations. The music echoed softly in the empty room, unheard by anyone else in the palace. Dragons had their own forms of artistic expression, patterns of light and sound that humans could barely comprehend. They would not understand this simple combination of strings and hammers creating harmony from the chaos of individual notes. But David understood. In the silence of the forgotten room with only an old piano for company, he remembered who he had been before the injury, before the exile, before he became just another invisible human in a galaxy that barely acknowledged his species existed. For a few precious hours each night he was a musician again, and that was enough to make the rest bearable. Tomorrow he would return to washing dishes and staying invisible, but tonight, in this moment, the music was everything. The emergency sirens began wailing at dawn, their piercing sound cutting through the morning quiet of Dracoris Prime. David dropped the breakfast tray he was carrying and watched through the kitchen windows as massive dragon forms launched themselves into the purple sky, their wings beating with desperate urgency. "What is happening?" Peter Walsh asked, his voice tight with fear. The young human had stayed close to David since the incident with the broken glasses, treating him like an older brother in this strange world of scales and fire. Master Chef Gorth burst into the kitchen, his usual green scales now flickering between orange and deep red. "The Void Swarm has returned," he announced, his voice carrying a tremor that David had never heard before. "All palace staff will remain at their stations. The Empress commands absolute order during this crisis." David felt ice form in his stomach. Every species in the galaxy knew the stories of the Void Swarm, the ancient enemy that had nearly destroyed civilization 1,000 years ago. They were beings of pure energy that consumed entire star systems, leaving nothing behind but empty space. The dragons had defeated them once, but only at enormous cost. Throughout the day, fragments of terrible news filtered down to the kitchen staff. The outer rim defenses had fallen in hours. 3 entire dragon battle fleets had vanished without sending so much as a distress call. The swarm was different this time, stronger, more organized than the historical records suggested. "How many ships do we have left?" one of the junior cooks asked during the afternoon meal preparation. "Ships mean nothing against the swarm," Gorth replied grimly. "Our ancestors learned that lesson in blood. The creatures exist partially outside normal space. Our most powerful weapons pass through them like light through glass." David continued his work in mechanical silence, but his mind was racing. His younger sister Emma lived on the colony world of New Haven, working as a teacher for the children of human miners. His parents had died years ago, but Emma was all the family he had left. If the Void Swarm was sweeping through human space, she could already be gone. That evening, instead of preparing the usual grand feast, the kitchen staff found themselves making simple meals for the dragon nobles who remained on planet. Most of the Empire's leadership had departed for emergency war councils and fortified systems, leaving only the essential government functions behind. David was carrying a tray of food through the service corridors when he heard voices coming from the main throne room. He should have continued on his way, but something in the tone made him pause. Through a partially open service door, he could see the assembled court. Empress Valeria dominated the great hall even while seated on her crystal throne. She was ancient beyond human comprehension, her scales the deep purple of royalty, her eyes burning with golden fire that had witnessed the rise and fall of entire civilizations. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of absolute power. "The archive of the ancients has been opened," she announced to the assembled nobles. "Our scholars have discovered reference to something called the resonance key, a weapon used by the first civilization against the swarm." An elderly dragon with silver scales stepped forward. "Your Majesty, the records are fragmentary at best. The ancients speak of an instrument of ordered chaos that can generate the precise harmonic frequency needed to disrupt the swarm's quantum coherence. But we cannot decipher what this instrument might be." Murmurs rippled through the assembled court. Dragons were beings of perfect logic and absolute order. The concept of ordered chaos was nearly incomprehensible to their way of thinking. David watched as the Empire's greatest minds struggled with ideas that seemed to contradict their fundamental understanding of reality. "Perhaps," suggested another noble, "the translation is imprecise. The ancients may have meant something else entirely." "We have checked the translation 17 times, the scholar replied. "The terms are consistent across all recovered fragments. An instrument that creates harmony from discord, order from chaos, pattern from randomness. Such a thing makes no logical sense." Empress Valeria's eyes blazed brighter with frustration. Around her, the most intelligent beings in the galaxy admitted defeat before a concept they could not grasp. David could see the terrible weight of responsibility crushing down on her shoulders. She was watching her empire die, and the weapon that might save it was hidden behind words that might as well be written in an alien language. "The records also mention numerical sequences," the scholar continued. "Mathematical progressions that must be incorporated into the frequency generation. But without understanding the instrument itself, we cannot determine how to produce the required resonance. Time grows short." "Your Majesty," reported General Thorne, his battle-scarred scales bearing witness to conflicts across the galaxy. "Long-range sensors show the swarm will reach the core systems within 10 rotations. If we cannot find this resonance key soon, the Empire falls." The throne room fell silent except for the quiet crackling of the great fire that burned in the ceremonial hearth. David could see the desperation in every dragon face, the growing realization that their proud civilization might be about to end. Then Empress Valeria rose from her throne, her massive form radiating power and barely controlled rage. When she spoke, her voice carried the rumble of distant thunder and the heat of barely contained fire. "We are the inheritors of the greatest empire in galactic history," she declared. "Our ancestors conquered death itself, bent reality to their will, and built wonders that lesser species still cannot comprehend. And yet we are defeated by words on a page?" Her golden gaze swept across the assembled nobles before settling on the alcoves, where various servant species waited in the shadows. David felt his heart skip as those burning eyes seemed to look directly at him. "Perhaps," the Empress continued, her voice dripping with contempt, "our great intellects are too refined for such primitive concepts. Perhaps we need the simple minds of lesser species to understand what the ancients meant by ordered chaos." She stepped down from the throne, her claws clicking against the crystal floor as she moved closer to the servant alcoves. "I make this pledge before the full court, witnessed by all. If any creature in this palace, no matter how lowly, can demonstrate this mysterious instrument and produce the resonance key that will save our empire, I will honor them beyond their wildest dreams." The court stirred with nervous energy. The Empress was known for her pride and her absolute refusal to elevate lower species beyond their station. "Indeed," she continued, her voice rising with what sounded almost like cruel amusement, "if any pathetic being here can solve the riddle that has defeated our greatest minds, can show us this instrument of ordered chaos and generate the frequency that will send the void swarm back to whatever hell spawned them, I will marry them. I will make them co-ruler of the Draconian Empire and elevate their entire species to positions of honor throughout our domain." The throne room erupted in shocked murmurs and nervous laughter. The idea was absurd beyond measure. The immortal Dragon Empress marrying a servant, elevating a lesser species to rule alongside the dragons. It was the stuff of fantasy, not reality. But David knew the ancient laws as well as any long-term palace servant. A formal pledge made by the ruler before the full court could not be retracted. It became as binding as the fundamental forces of physics themselves. As the court dissolved into chaos and the nobles debated the implications of their empress's shocking declaration, David slipped away through the service corridors. His hands were shaking, not with fear, but with a growing excitement that he barely dared to acknowledge. An instrument of ordered chaos that created harmony from discord. He knew exactly what that was. David barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the mathematical sequences the dragon scholar had mentioned, trying to match them to musical patterns he knew. By morning, his head was pounding and his injured hand was cramping from unconsciously flexing his fingers all night. The kitchen was buzzing with gossip about the Empress's impossible challenge. The dragon staff spoke in hushed tones about the arrogance of lesser species who might actually believe they could succeed where the Empire's greatest minds had failed. The human workers, meanwhile, seemed caught between hope and terror at the possibility that one of their kind might actually step forward. "Did you hear what she said?" Peter whispered to David as they worked side by side at the washing station. "She promised to marry whoever solves the puzzle." "Can you imagine? A human married to the Dragon Empress?" "It is not a marriage proposal," David replied quietly. "It is a death sentence for whoever is foolish enough to try and fail." But even as he spoke, David was mentally reviewing everything he had overheard the night before. The instrument of ordered chaos, the mathematical sequences, the harmonic frequency that could disrupt quantum coherence, it all pointed to one inescapable conclusion, but accepting that conclusion meant risking everything. Throughout the day, reports continued to arrive from the outer systems. The Void Swarm was accelerating its advance, consuming star systems at an unprecedented rate. Refugee ships limped into the core systems carrying survivors who spoke of entire planets simply vanishing, leaving behind only empty space where worlds had existed for billions of years. David found himself thinking about Emma again. Her last message had come from New Haven 3 days ago, a cheerful recording about her students and their latest art projects. The communication networks to the outer colonies had gone silent yesterday. She could be dead already, consumed along with her world by creatures of living energy that devoured matter itself. That evening, David made his way to the forgotten practice room earlier than usual. He needed to be certain before he did something that would either save the galaxy or get him killed in the most spectacular way possible. The old piano waited in the darkness, patient as always. He started with simple scales, warming up his fingers and testing his damaged hand's capabilities. Then he moved to Bach, specifically the Goldberg variations that had become his favorite piece over the past 3 years. As he played, he began to see the mathematical relationships more clearly. The numerical sequences the dragon scholar had mentioned followed a specific pattern, one that appeared throughout Bach's work. The great composer had been fascinated by mathematical structures in music, creating pieces that were as much exercises in pure mathematics as they were expressions of human emotion. The Goldberg variations in particular contained geometric progressions, harmonic ratios, and frequency relationships that formed a kind of musical mathematics. David pulled out a piece of paper and began working through the numbers, translating the ancient sequences into musical notation. What he found made his heart race. The sequences weren't random at all. They were instructions for a specific harmonic progression, one that would generate a resonant frequency that pulsed in perfect mathematical relationship to the quantum vibrations that held matter together. But creating that frequency required more than just hitting the right notes. It needed the complex interplay of harmonics that only a properly tuned piano could produce. The instrument was indeed one of ordered chaos. Its 88 keys arranged in a pattern that seemed random to the uninitiated, but followed deep mathematical principles to those who understood. David spent the next 2 days preparing. He worked his regular shifts in the kitchen, but every free moment was spent in the practice room, working out the exact arrangement needed to weave the ancient frequency into Bach's masterwork. It would require modifications to the original composition, subtle changes that incorporated the mathematical sequences while preserving the musical integrity of the piece. His left hand protested constantly. The arrangement he was developing required techniques at the very edge of his abilities, forcing his damaged nerves to perform in ways they hadn't since before his injury. He practiced until his fingers bled, then bandaged them and practiced more. On the 3rd day, news arrived that made David's decision for him. The Void Swarm had reached the Middle Rim systems. New Haven was gone, vanished along with the 3 other colony worlds in its sector. Emma was dead, along with millions of other humans who had been trying to build new lives among the stars. David stared at the casualty reports, feeling something break inside his chest. His sister had been 26 years old, brilliant and kind and full of hope for the future. Now she was nothing but dispersed energy, consumed by creatures that treated entire civilizations as nothing more than food. That evening, he made his final preparations. He cleaned and tuned the old piano as best he could with the tools available in the storage room. He practiced the modified arrangement one more time, working through every difficult passage until he was confident he could perform it despite his limitations. Then he sat in the darkness and considered what he was about to do. Speaking up in the Imperial Court meant almost certain death if he was wrong. Dragons didn't tolerate mockery from lower species, and the Empress in particular was known for her swift and terrible justice. He would have one chance to prove himself, and failure would likely result in being incinerated on the spot. But if he succeeded, if the ancient resonance key actually worked, he could save not just the Dragon Empire but every living being in the galaxy. The Void Swarm consumed everything in their path, making no distinction between species or civilizations. They were extinction itself given form and purpose. David thought about Emma teaching her students, about Peter Walsh trying so hard to please his dragon masters, about all the humans scattered across the galaxy who had never asked for anything more than the chance to live peaceful lives. He thought about the dragon nobles who, for all their arrogance, were fighting desperately to save their people. He thought about the billions of other species who called this galaxy home. The choice, when it came down to it, was simple. He could stay silent and let the galaxy burn, or he could risk everything on the chance that a broken-down human pianist might understand something that the greatest minds in the Empire had missed. David stood up from the piano bench and began walking toward the throne room. His hands were steady now, his mind clear. He had made his decision. In the service corridor outside the Great Hall, he paused to listen to the voices within. The court was in session, receiving the latest reports from the front lines. The news was getting worse by the hour. Soon there would be no front lines left, just the Void Swarm consuming everything in its path until it reached the heart of civilization itself. David took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and stepped into the throne room. 100 pairs of eyes turned toward him, most filled with confusion at seeing a human servant interrupt the Imperial Court. But David kept walking forward until he stood before the crystal throne where Empress Valeria sat in all her terrible majesty. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent hall, "I believe I can demonstrate the instrument of ordered chaos." The words hung in the air like a challenge to fate itself. There was no taking them back now. The silence in the throne room stretched like a held breath. Empress Valeria's golden eyes fixed on David with the intensity of twin suns, and he felt the weight of her ancient gaze pressing down on him like a physical force. Around the great hall, dragon nobles shifted uneasily, their scales flickering through colors that spoke of confusion and barely restrained anger. "You dare interrupt the Imperial Court?" The Empress's voice was soft, which somehow made it more terrifying than if she had roared. "A dish cleaner presumes to solve mysteries that have defeated our greatest scholars?" David's throat felt dry as sand, but he forced himself to speak clearly. "Your Majesty, entire star systems are dying. If there is even the smallest chance that I might be able to help, surely it is worth a few minutes of the court's time." General Thorne stepped forward, his battle-scarred scales shifting to deep red. "The human mocks us, Your Majesty. This insult cannot be tolerated." "Wait." The Empress raised one clawed hand and the general froze in place. Her gaze never left David's face. "You claim to understand what the ancients meant by their instrument of ordered chaos?" "I do, Your Majesty." David's heart hammered against his ribs, but his voice remained steady. "If you would honor me with a few minutes of your time, I can show you exactly what they meant." The court erupted in angry mutters. Dragons who had never paid attention to human servants suddenly found themselves confronted by one who dared speak as an equal. The arrogance was breathtaking, the presumption beyond comprehension. But Empress Valeria raised her hand again, and silence fell like a curtain. She studied David for a long moment, her ancient intelligence weighing possibilities behind those burning eyes. "Very well," she said finally. "You have 5 minutes to explain yourself before I decide whether your boldness deserves reward or punishment." David bowed deeply, buying himself a moment to organize his thoughts. When he straightened, he gestured toward the service entrance. "Your Majesty, the instrument cannot be described in words alone. If you would honor me with your presence, I can show you something that might save us all." The request was audacious beyond measure. David was asking the immortal ruler of the greatest empire in galactic history to follow a human servant through palace corridors to some unknown destination. The very idea violated every protocol of imperial dignity. Yet something in David's manner, some quality of quiet certainty, gave the Empress pause. She could sense no deception in him, no trace of madness or mockery, just a desperate sincerity that spoke of someone who believed absolutely in what he was about to reveal. "Lead the way," she commanded, rising from her crystal throne. What followed was perhaps the strangest procession in the long history of Dracoris Prime. The Dragon Empress, her full court of noble dragons and hundreds of lesser species all followed a human dish cleaner. Through service corridors that most of them had never seen before, guards flanked the procession, their weapons ready in case this proved to be some elaborate assassination attempt. David led them through the maze of forgotten passages to the abandoned concert hall where he had spent countless hours over the past 3 years. The room was exactly as he had left it, dust motes dancing in the filtered light that came through crystal windows. And in the center of the space sat the old piano, its wooden case worn but still dignified after decades of neglect. The dragons stared at the instrument with expressions of complete bewilderment. To their eyes, it was nothing more than a primitive wooden box with a row of white and black levers arranged across one end. They could see no technology, no energy source, no mechanism that might generate the complex frequencies needed to affect quantum-level phenomena. "This," David said, moving to stand beside the piano, "is called a piano. It is a musical instrument created by humans centuries ago." He pulled back the cover that protected the keys, revealing the familiar keyboard that had been his companion through so many lonely nights. "Music?" General Thorne's voice dripped with contempt. "You waste our time with primitive noise-making devices while the Empire burns?" "Not noise, General," David replied calmly. "Mathematics. Pure mathematics expressed as organized sound." He sat on the bench, his hands hovering over the keys. The ancients called it an instrument of ordered chaos because it takes seemingly random combinations of tones and transforms them into complex harmonic structures that follow precise mathematical laws. He pressed a single key, and a clear note rang through the chamber. Several dragons flinched at the sound, unfamiliar as they were with human musical traditions. "Each key produces a specific frequency," David explained. "When combined with other keys, these frequencies create mathematical relationships, harmonics, intervals, progressions that follow geometric patterns." He played a simple scale, the notes ascending in perfect mathematical progression. "What you hear as music is actually applied mathematics. Every piece follows rules as precise as any scientific formula." The ancients understood this. They knew that certain mathematical relationships, when expressed as sound, could affect the fundamental vibrations that hold matter together. Empress Valeria moved closer, her massive form casting shadows across the piano. "You claim this primitive device can generate the resonance key?" "Not just generate it, Your Majesty. Weave it into a complex harmonic structure that will carry the frequency across subspace through your quantum communication networks." David's fingers found their positions on the keys. "The ancient sequences you discovered are not random numbers. They are musical notation, instructions for a specific harmonic progression that incorporates the resonant frequency into a larger mathematical structure." He began to play, starting with the gentle opening theme of the Goldberg Variations. The simple melody seemed to fill the dusty room with warmth, its mathematical elegance becoming apparent as the theme developed and repeated, with subtle variations. This piece was composed by a human named Johann Sebastian Bach 300 years ago, David explained as he played. He was fascinated by the mathematical structures underlying music, and this particular composition incorporates geometric progressions, harmonic ratios, and frequency relationships that match the ancient sequences in your archive. The dragons listened in growing amazement as the music unfolded. Their logical minds began to perceive the elegant mathematical structures underlying what had initially seemed like random sounds. They could see how themes developed and interweaved, how complex harmonies resolved into satisfying conclusions, how the entire piece followed rules as precise as any engineering formula. "But I have made modifications," David continued, his fingers dancing across the keys despite the protests from his injured hand. The ancient sequences must be woven into the composition, creating a harmonic progression that generates the exact frequency needed to disrupt the void swarm's quantum coherence. The music began to change, becoming more complex as David incorporated the alien mathematical sequences into Bach's masterwork. The melody took on new dimensions, harmonies that seemed to resonate not just in the air but in the very structure of reality itself. As the piece built toward its climax, something extraordinary began to happen. The modified variation that contained the core frequency started to generate harmonics that seemed to exist beyond normal sound. The dragons could feel it in their bones, a vibration that touched something fundamental in the way matter held itself together. David's injured hand was screaming with pain, but he pushed through it, knowing he would only get one chance to prove himself. The music reached its crescendo, the ancient resonance key woven seamlessly into the mathematical perfection of human musical tradition. And then, as if responding to some cosmic signal, alerts began chiming throughout the palace's communication systems. The quantum arrays that broadcast all imperial proceedings across the empire had automatically transmitted the performance, carrying the resonance key to every corner of draconian space. The effect was immediate and miraculous. Wherever the frequency reached, the void swarm entities that had been consuming star systems suddenly recoiled, their quantum coherence disrupted by the precise harmonic vibrations. They began retreating back toward the dimensional barriers that separated normal space from their realm of pure energy. David finished the piece with the gentle, concluding aria that brought the Goldberg variations full circle. As the last notes faded into silence, he looked up to see the entire court of the Draconian Empire staring at him in absolute amazement. The dish cleaner had just saved the galaxy with nothing more than an old piano and 3 centuries of human musical tradition. The communications console in the corner of the abandoned concert hall crackled to life, breaking the stunned silence that had followed David's performance. General Thorne moved to the device, his massive claws dancing across controls with surprising delicacy as he accessed the military command network. "Reports coming in from the Outer Rim defense grid," he announced, his voice tight with disbelief. "The Void Swarm entities are retreating, all of them simultaneously across a front spanning 3 galactic arms." More voices joined the reports, dragon commanders who had been preparing for their final battles now describing an impossible reversal of fortune. The creatures of living energy that had been consuming entire star systems were fleeing back toward the dimensional barriers that separated normal space from their realm. "Confirmation from the 5th Battle Fleet," another voice reported. "The swarm entities are destabilizing. Their quantum coherence is breaking down wherever the transmission reached. Admiral Korax reports complete withdrawal from the Tertia system." David remained seated at the piano bench, his hands trembling with exhaustion and the aftershocks of adrenaline. His injured left hand felt like it was on fire, the damaged nerves screaming their protest at being pushed far beyond their limits. But as he listened to the reports flooding in from across the Empire, he felt a profound sense of peace settling over him. Emma was still gone. Nothing could bring back his sister or the millions of others who had been consumed before the resonance key could be deployed. But the galaxy would survive, and no other families would have to endure the loss that had driven him to this desperate gambit. "The quantum disruption appears to be permanent," reported the chief science advisor over the communication link. "The harmonic frequency has created a standing wave pattern throughout subspace that prevents the void swarm from maintaining coherence in our dimensional framework. They are being forced back to whatever realm spawned them." Empress Valeria had not moved or spoken since the music ended. She stood before the piano like a statue carved from purple crystal, her golden eyes fixed on David with an expression that was impossible to read. Around her, the assembled court whispered among themselves in the ancient dragon language, their voices carrying notes of wonder and confusion. Finally, the Empress spoke. "How long have you possessed this knowledge?" 3 days, Your Majesty," David replied honestly. "I recognized the description of the instrument when I heard it, but I needed time to work out how to incorporate the ancient sequences into the musical structure. 3 days." She repeated the words as if they contained some hidden meaning. "In 3 days, a human dish cleaner solved a mystery that defeated the combined intellects of our greatest scholars." "How is this possible?" David considered his answer carefully. "Because you were looking for something logical, Your Majesty. Dragons are beings of perfect order, absolute rationality, The concept of ordered chaos is foreign to your way of thinking, but humans live in the space between chaos and order. We are comfortable with contradiction, with things that should not work but do. He gestured at the piano. This instrument embodies that contradiction. 88 keys arranged in a pattern that seems arbitrary, yet follows deep mathematical principles. Music that sounds like pure emotion but is actually applied mathematics. It creates beauty from complexity, harmony from discord. General Thorne stepped closer, his scales still flickering with colors of amazement. You speak as if all humans possess this capability. Not this specific knowledge, David admitted, but the ability to find patterns in chaos to create meaning from contradiction. Yes, General, it is perhaps the most essentially human trait. We are creatures of both logic and emotion, order and creativity. We excel at bridging gaps that other species cannot even perceive. The implications of this revelation rippled through the assembled court. Dragons had always viewed humans as primitive, barely evolved creatures who had achieved space travel through luck rather than true intelligence. The idea that human cognitive patterns might be fundamentally different, rather than simply inferior, challenged their basic assumptions about the nature of intelligence itself. There is another matter we must address, the Empress said, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been amusement. I made a pledge before the full court, witnessed by all present. A pledge that cannot be retracted under the ancient laws. David felt his stomach clench as he remembered her words. In the excitement of stopping the void swarm, he had almost forgotten about the Empress's promise. Almost forgotten that success would bring consequences he had never seriously considered. You have fulfilled the conditions of my challenge, she continued. You have demonstrated the instrument of ordered chaos and provided the resonance key that saved our empire. By law and honor, I am bound to fulfill my promise. The court fell silent again, dragons and lesser species alike waiting to see how this unprecedented situation would be resolved. The idea of the immortal dragon empress marrying a human servant was so far outside the normal order of things that no one quite knew how to react. But before we proceed, the Empress said, moving closer to the piano, I must understand who you truly are. Dish cleaners do not typically possess such extraordinary musical abilities. So David told his story. He spoke of his life on Earth as a concert pianist, the injury that ended his career, the loss of his family's farm to corporate expansion, and his journey to Dracoris Prime in search of work. He described the years of invisible service in the palace kitchens, and the nights spent in this forgotten room, slowly teaching himself to play again despite his damaged hand. He spoke of Emma, his brilliant sister who had died on New Haven, and how her loss had given him the courage to risk everything in one desperate attempt to prevent others from experiencing the same grief. His voice remained steady throughout, but the dragons could hear the deep current of pain that ran beneath his words. When he finished, Empress Valeria was quiet for a long moment. You were a master of your art, yet you accepted the role of servant without complaint. You possessed knowledge that could save us all, yet you revealed it only when driven by personal loss. This speaks to a character I had not expected to find in any lesser species. She turned to address the assembled court. The laws are clear. This human has earned the right to rule alongside me, and his species has demonstrated capabilities that demand our respect rather than our condescension. General Thorne stepped forward, his expression troubled. Your Majesty, surely the ancient laws never contemplated such a situation. The marriage of dragon and human, the elevation of an entire species to positions of authority, these are changes that will transform the very nature of our empire. Yes, the Empress replied simply. They are. She looked back at David, and for the first time her expression softened slightly. The question now is whether you are prepared for such changes. Being co-ruler of the Draconian Empire is not merely a title. It carries responsibilities that will consume your entire existence. David met her gaze steadily. Your Majesty, I have spent 5 years learning how your empire functions, watching how decisions at the highest levels affect the lives of ordinary beings. I understand the weight of what you are offering. And your answer? David thought of Emma, of Peter Walsh trying so hard to survive in a world that barely acknowledged his existence, of all the humans scattered across the galaxy who deserved better than to remain invisible. He thought of the dragons themselves, proud beings who had nearly lost everything to an enemy they could not understand alone. I accept, he said quietly. not for personal ambition, but because I believe humans and dragons can achieve more together than either species can accomplish alone." The Empress smiled then, the first time David had ever seen such an expression on a dragon face. "Then let us begin the work of building a new kind of empire, one that values both the perfection of order and the creativity of chaos." As the court began to disperse, already buzzing with plans and preparations for the most unprecedented wedding in galactic history, David remained at the piano. His hands found the keys one more time, playing a simple melody that seemed to capture both the sorrow of what had been lost and the hope of what might yet be built. The music echoed through the chamber where everything had changed, carrying with it the promise of a future where the impossible had become inevitable. 5 years after the day a dish cleaner saved the galaxy, David stood on the balcony of the Imperial Music Conservatory and watched the sun set over New Dracoris City. The capital had grown beyond recognition, its crystal spires now joined by structures that blended dragon architectural mastery with human aesthetic sensibilities. The result was a city that seemed to sing with its own inner harmony. Below, in the great concert hall that had become the heart of the conservatory, musicians from dozens of species were preparing for the evening's performance. The first interspecies harmonic symphony would premiere tonight, a composition that wove together musical traditions from every member world of the expanded galactic community. "Nervous?" Valeria asked, joining him on the balcony. 5 years of marriage had changed them both in ways neither had expected. She was still the immortal dragon Empress, still possessed of power that could reshape worlds, but she had learned to appreciate the subtle complexities of human emotion, and David had grown into his role as co-ruler, his understanding of both species allowing him to bridge gaps that had seemed unbridgeable. "Always," David admitted, flexing his left hand. The injury still bothered him, especially before important performances, but he had long since learned to work with his limitations rather than against them. "But it is a good kind of nervous, the kind that means something important is about to happen." Through the balcony doors they could hear the orchestra tuning their instruments, dragons with their crystalline harps that played frequencies beyond human hearing, humans with their pianos, violins, and wind instruments, the insectoid chord singers from the harmony worlds, whose bodies were themselves musical instruments. The rock people of Granite Prime, who created rhythm through controlled seismic vibrations. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" Valeria asked. "About humans being creatures of contradiction, comfortable in the space between chaos and order?" David nodded. "I was trying not to get incinerated for my presumption. You were speaking a deeper truth than either of us realized then." She gestured toward the concert hall, where beings from across the galaxy were creating something that none of their species could have achieved alone. "This is what you gave us, David. Not just the resonance key, but a new way of thinking about cooperation itself." The changes had not come easily. The dragon nobility had initially resisted the elevation of humans to positions of real authority within the empire. Many had seen David's marriage to the Empress as an aberration to be tolerated rather than celebrated. But as human insights proved valuable again and again, as their unique cognitive patterns helped solve problems that had stymied dragon logic, attitudes had gradually shifted. The breakthrough had come 18 months ago, when the Empire made contact with the Crystalline Collective, a hive mind species whose thought patterns were so alien that communication seemed impossible. Dragon telepaths could not penetrate their mental barriers, and conventional translation protocols failed completely. But human musicians, working with the mathematical structures underlying their art, had discovered that the collective communicated through harmonic resonances that followed musical principles. A team led by Peter Walsh, who had grown from frightened dish cleaner to accomplished xenolinguist, had developed the first successful translation protocol. That success had opened floodgates. Human creativity, combined with dragon precision, had revolutionized everything from quantum engineering to interspecies diplomacy. The Empire had evolved into something unprecedented, a truly collaborative civilization where different ways of thinking were valued, rather than merely tolerated. "The symphony tonight," David said. "It represents more than just music. It is proof that differences can create harmony rather than discord." "Ordered chaos," Valeria said with a smile. "I finally understand what the ancients meant." They made their way down to the concert hall, where over 3,000 beings from across the galaxy had gathered for the premiere. In the front row, David spotted familiar faces. Peter Walsh, now the director of interspecies communication, Master Chef Gorth, who had become an unlikely advocate for human culinary arts, General Thorne, whose initial skepticism had transformed into grudging respect. The orchestra was massive, requiring the entire stage of the Great Hall and spilling out into specially designed acoustic chambers. David had spent 2 years composing the symphony, weaving together musical traditions that spanned millions of years of evolutionary development. The result was unlike anything that had ever existed, a musical conversation between species that found common ground in mathematics while celebrating their unique voices. David took his place at the conductor's podium, a position that would have been unimaginable for a human 5 years ago. The orchestra fell silent, hundreds of beings from dozens of worlds waiting for his signal. He raised his baton, and music filled the hall. The symphony began with earth instruments, the familiar sounds of piano and strings establishing musical themes that were recognizably human in their blend of logic and emotion. Gradually, other voices joined. The crystalline perfection of dragon harmonies, the complex rhythms of the rock people, the ethereal tones of the gas giant dwellers. What made the piece extraordinary was not just the variety of sounds, but the way David had found mathematical relationships that allowed each species' musical traditions to complement rather than compete with the others. Melodies that seemed chaotic in isolation revealed themselves as part of larger structures when combined with harmonies from other worlds. As the music progressed, the audience began to understand what they were witnessing. This was not just entertainment, but a demonstration of a new kind of civilization. Each species contributed what it did best, and the result was greater than the sum of its parts. The dragon sections showcased the mathematical perfection that their species brought to every endeavor. The human part celebrated the creative chaos that found beauty in contradiction. Other species added their own unique voices, the collective harmonies of hive minds, the patient rhythms of long-lived species, the rapid-fire complexity of beings who thought in microseconds. Midway through the performance, David incorporated a modified version of the resonance key that had started everything. Not the frequency that disrupted quantum coherence, but a gentler variation that seemed to resonate with the fundamental forces that held the galaxy together. The audience felt it as much as heard it, a vibration that spoke of unity without uniformity, cooperation without coercion. As the symphony moved toward its conclusion, David found himself thinking about Emma. She had died before seeing what her brother's desperate gamble would ultimately create. But he liked to think she would have been proud. The galaxy she had helped save through her sacrifice had become something beautiful, a harmony of voices that honored both differences and commonalities. The final movement brought all the orchestral voices together in a crescendo that seemed to make the concert hall itself sing. Every species, every instrument, every unique way of creating and perceiving sound combined into a single, magnificent expression of what was possible when beings chose cooperation over conflict. As the last notes faded into silence, the audience erupted in appreciation expressed in dozens of different ways. Dragons created patterns of light with their natural bioluminescence. Humans applauded. The rock people generated subsonic rumbles of approval. The gas dwellers released aromatic clouds that conveyed satisfaction. David lowered his baton and turned to face the audience. In their faces, he saw the future of galactic civilization. Not dragon or human or any single species, but something new and wonderful that had emerged from their willingness to listen to each other's songs. Later that night, in their private chambers, Valeria found David sitting at the piano where it all had begun. The old Earth instrument had been restored and relocated to a place of honor in their home, a reminder of how something seemingly insignificant could change the course of history. "What are you playing?" she asked, settling beside him on the specially reinforced bench. "Just remembering," David replied, his fingers picking out the gentle melody of the Goldberg variations. "Thinking about how far we have all come, and where we might go next." David smiled and began a new improvisation, one that wove together dragon harmonics with human melody. "Wherever the music takes us," he said. "Together." Outside their window, New Dracora's city hummed with the quiet activity of a civilization at peace with itself. In laboratories and meeting halls, in schools and marketplaces, Beings from across the galaxy worked together on projects that none of them could have imagined alone. The dish cleaner who had once washed plates in invisible silence had helped create a symphony that spanned the stars. And in doing so, he had proven that the most profound changes often begin with someone brave enough to step forward and play a different tune. The music continued, soft and gentle in the quiet night, carrying with it the promise of harmonies yet to be discovered.